Welcome, Anna.
Thank you, Martin. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see you all.
It's wonderful to have you on our show today, Anna. A few years ago, you completed a postdoc at Oxford University and are now engaged in a 4-year project researching music and clowning, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. You are a musicologist. What does that mean, and how do you become one?
So, how I became one, that's a good question. First, I really didn't want to become a musicologist because I loved to play piano and to listen to music, and I loved music, and I had this strange idea that somehow if you did musicology and if you to dig into music and start breaking it into pieces and analyzing it, it would spoil it on some level. And finally, in the end, I just thought, okay, I'll give it a try. And I discovered that actually it had the opposite effect, and that precisely the listening even more and the analyzing and the putting music into its context actually increased the pleasure of listening and playing music. So that's how I became one. So I just right away discovered that it was exactly what I had to do. And what does it mean? Well, I would say it's really about discovering more about the context of a work or of a composer, the conditions in which a work has been written or performed. And it also deals with links that can be made. It actually allows the study of music in a musicological sense, allows to see new links between different musical works, between music and other arts, and between music and the world. So it's a sort of, it increases the web of relationship that can be born from music. And it also, more than anything, can change our hearing of music and our experience of music. So the more we discover, the more we understand, the more we think about music, the more we know about music, changes our hearing. And yeah, that's it. It's actually that's what I would say musicology is.
I'm a musicologist too, and I also had to become one. I think that this is something of a calling, but people often have asked me, does the world need musicology? We can hear these pieces and we can enjoy them. You've made a good argument for the thought process that might engage our listening process in a way that enhances both. So to take an example, your book on Mahler's Seventh Symphony was published last year by Oxford University Press. How and why does one go about writing a book about a musical composition? Isn't it enough to hear the music?
So good question. So of course, hearing the music is the most important thing. And I would say always start from there. So even when I study something or I have to write or think about any music, I always start just with the music by listening and by looking at the score and see what can. So I always like to first hear and have my own impressions of the work before I read anything or I try to know anything more about it. So, but I would say I really like these different kind of hearings that we can have about music. First, a sort of instinctive hearing when we listen to a piece we don't know much about. I really like to gather impressions and emotions about it, and then discover more and know more and think more about the music that generates new ways of hearing or listening. But it doesn't mean that the first hearing that we had before we knew something about it would disappear. And actually, it's really nice to always be able, even now when I listen to the Seventh Symphony after having spent, I don't know how many years analyzing it, when I listen to it in the concert hall, I always try to go back to this sort of first fresh hearing when I didn't know anything about it. So it's just really a way of adding a new way of listening that can be doesn't mean that it erases the first hearing. So
So, before people read your book, they have to hear the Seventh Symphony. In other words, you're advising them to do exactly that.
Yes, definitely. So I probably I never thought that actually reading a book was a good point of entry into music. So I would say listen to it and enjoy it, and or maybe be puzzled by it. And then maybe you will find something in the book that will maybe puzzle you more or help you see, hear it in another way. So that's really the idea that, yeah, I really see that book as a sort of contributing to proposing a new layer of interpretation for the Seventh Symphony. So it's just proposes another way of listening to it that can be put, in comparison or in parallel with other ways of hearing it.
Well, let's start there though, because many listeners, including Mahler lovers, find the Seventh Symphony a difficult piece. Just the listening process, never mind reading about it. Why do you think that is?
So I think there are several reasons for this sort of special status of the Seventh Symphony within the Mahler canon. And because if you look at the reception history of the work, initially in 1908, when it was first performed, it wasn't really an especially bad reception or negative reception. But it's really later in the 1960s when the Mahler Renaissance began and people starting to listen and play and think and write about Mahler again, that the Seventh had acquired this sort of special status. We heard it. We spoke about the Cinderella status of the Seventh Symphony, or the problem child of Mahler. And I think it has to do with several things. One of them is the level of musical allusion in the work. I think that the Seventh Symphony has, I mean, we know that Mahler, you can find many musical allusions in all of Mahler's works. But in the Seventh, maybe they are used in a more specific way. Especially there is much Wagner in the Seventh, and I think that's part of the problem, that people heard too many references to works without being able to actually make them work together in creating a coherent discourse or a coherent narrative of the work. And I think it has a lot to do with the Sixth Symphony and the way we hear the Sixth Symphony as a tragedy and a fall and a collapse down or below to death. And we don't know, there is a German scholar who had a really good expression about the Seventh. He talked about the Seventh being music after the catastrophe. And I really like this expression because to me, it points exactly to the problem of the Seventh, as after the tragedy and the crash of the Sixth Symphony, we don't know what to do with this music that is very noisy, especially at the end, with all these trumpets and drums, and we don't. It's very difficult to understand what to make of it after the tragedy of the Sixth.
Well, Adorno couldn't. I mean, he condemned the piece by referring to the finale and Mahler's efforts to bringing optimism after the catastrophe as a schlechter Ja-Sager, and of course that doesn't help either the reception. Your book belongs to a series entitled Studies in Musical Genesis, Structure, and Interpretation. But those terms shouldn't frighten away the audience. I mean, of course, you can get into a lot of detail with that, and you explore all of those. But you alluded to the fact that there's much going on in this music that perhaps your book can help explain. So what are some of the takeaways? What are some of the things that people maybe could help orient them in better understanding the allusions you just talked about?
So first, what I really like about this series is that it's a very specific way of looking at a work of a musical work. And what is really specific in this series is that it not only looks at the work, the piece, in a sort of static sense as an object that has to be analyzed and understood in itself, but it really looks at it in the process of becoming as well. So the genesis side is very important. So it's sort of at the same time considering the Seventh Symphony in that case in its process of becoming, so in time, and also in the ways it has been understood and heard in time, but at the same time consider the finished products and see how we can understand it, how it works, how the structure is shaped. So it's really the characteristics of writing a book in such a series is really that you always have to go back and forth between the sort of locating the Seventh Symphony in history and in time, and looking at it, imposing on it, and looking at it on that regard. So maybe one of the things I would say that comes out of this book is the attention given to the sketches that are usually considered to be rejected. So I really spent lots of time looking at all the music that seems not have been used by Mahler. And so in my view, it's really to show the importance that actually, when we look at the genesis of a work, we look at most of the time at what has been used and how the sketches became the finished work. But I really think it's very important as well to look at all the materials that Mahler considered, but didn't use in the finished work. And it really helps give another view on the finished version. Also on the matter of sketch studies and what it can bring us, it's really, for example, at some points, I talk about this amazing moment in the first movement that we can consider as a sort of breakthrough, this B major moment that is absolutely amazing and that has been commented so much upon since the premiere in 1908. So it's really interesting to see that actually this crucial moment, we have the impression that the whole movement is going there and that's the actual goal of the movement, has been added very late in the compositional process. So this idea that late thoughts sometimes are really building stones, and that it's not really chronological. It's not that you build first with the important things and then the less important is added later. And also just maybe where can sketch studies lead us? So looking at sketches and drafts and documents like this can actually lead to think about Mahler's relationship to Wagner or to German culture in general. So it's really, that's what I tried to show here is how sketches can actually lead you to think about unsuspected aspects in the music and also in Mahler the man and his relationship to the world.
Well, his relationship to Wagner here, of course, is in a sense a subtext to the entire book and the entire symphony in some ways. Maybe you can just quickly tell the audience, how does Wagner figure in here musically? What, I mean, the Meistersinger gesture and things like that, yeah, that come forth.
So it's really especially obvious in the finale, as many listeners have been hearing since 1908, that the finale has this ritornello, this refrain that is really recalling the Meistersinger Ouverture, the Meistersinger's march, actually opening march. And so this comes back all the time in the finale. And I really started from there because in the sketches, in the sketchbook where we find many sketches for the Seventh Symphony, there is a sketch that made me think of Beckmesser's Serenade in Meistersinger. So there is really, this is how I began to consider the importance of Meistersinger for the Seventh Symphony, is by looking at a sketch that was actually not used in the finished work. So that's how I began to think, actually unused sketches can be really crucial for our understanding of the work, because it's clearly Wagner, when you start to look at the Seventh through the Wagner lens, you find him pretty much not everywhere, but in many unsuspected places, actually.
So will we hear the Seventh differently after reading your book?
Well, I hope so. You can tell me once, if you read the book, you can tell me if it worked or not. But I tried to give a sort of go dig into the work and dig into the detail of it and see what can be said from the sketches in a close analysis of the work. And then I tried to take a step back and see what kind of picture is the Seventh telling us, and what kind of trajectory we have. If we think about the Sixth Symphony as a sort of gigantic march towards death and catastrophe and collapse, then the Seventh tells us something else. And I see it really as, this is what I propose in the book, as an ascending movement. And if the Eighth Symphony, for example, is clearly going upwards through redemption, through love. The Seventh Symphony, in my mind, is really going up as well, upwards, but through humor and a sort of comical spirit. And this is what I propose in the book. And I think that nowadays, we really need to remember the importance of this comical spirit. And I think the Seventh Symphony is telling us something about humor and comedy. And that's why I think it's even more relevant today than it was, or maybe it's always relevant, but maybe even more today.
Well, of course, and that might explain the disconnect for some listeners. Mahler and comedy are not necessarily common bedfellows in our conception of what he's about, but he is a full human being and he embraces the whole human experience. So it shouldn't be that surprising. Clearly, we'll never stop discovering things about this composer and his music. I want to thank you very much, Anna, for your thoughts, and I hope people will discover your book as well.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.